Thank you, and good morning, everyone. So I think before I start, when Wendy first asked me for my photograph to be put up, I was shocked over the weekend when I saw it was so enlarged, because I was so worried that it shows all the hair that has been disappearing. So rest assured, I'm not robot. I'm human. I do lose my hair, and I do work quite a bit. So I only have two objectives today. I have 20 minutes here. I'm going to do two things, right? Number one, I'm going to talk about what RPA is, because I think a lot of you might have heard about RPA, but in many of my interactions with clients, most people would have some understanding of what it is, but maybe not a full appreciation, right? So I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about what RPA is, and then we can talk about the implications of RPA against shared services organizations, or for those who are using BPO. Let me try and move on to the next page. It doesn't seem to work. It's the sensor. Okay. So as we reboot the system, so how many of you here are familiar with what RPA is, so that I can either go through faster? Who is familiar with what RPA is? Show of hands. So that's less than half. Okay, I think in the interest of time, let me also try and talk without the slides, right? So typically RPA is, if you think about RPA, I guess the simplest analogy is to compare RPA with an Excel macro, right? Most of you in finance would love Excels, and you would have used macros in some way or another. So RPA is like a super macro, right? So what you do in macro today, where you define rules in Excel, to say perform certain activities in certain fields, certain areas of formatting, what RPA does is it does exactly the same thing. The big difference is it does this across all applications, right? So you have macros in Excel, but in RPA, you could then do any task that you could do, if you could define the rules of it. So for example, let's take a very simple example, right? If you today go to certain websites every morning to get someone in your team to extract, say, your currency exchange rates, right? Your Sing US dollar, Sing Euro rates, and input into the system, right? Think of the steps here. This is something that's extremely rule-based, and the steps are really something that we can define, right? So in so long as you can define the steps very clearly, that's what RPA can do, right? It can then go into a certain web page, it can pull data, it can log into your accounting systems, go into the necessary menu or T codes if you're using SAP, and from there, it then inputs the value, right? So imagine all the activities that you do in finance today, anything that is rule-based, that, if you and me sit down together, we can sit and we can transcribe and write down the rules for these activities to be done, regardless of whether it is pulling a file from an email, imputing into a system, running, generating reports. There are really immense opportunities to look at how we can automate this using RPA, right? So hopefully that gives you a perspective of how RPA comes into play and its application. So I will have a video later to also show you an example of how RPA works in the bigger scheme of things, and from there, I think the key thing for you is, once this is done, go back and think through what are activities that takes up a lot of time today, that is very rule-based in your organization, in your teams, and you would find that in today's world, despite having ERPs in place, you actually still have at least 20-30% of your colleagues' time spent doing very manual activities, and these are really opportunities for us to look at automating them. Okay, so some studies have shown, which is actually the first slide I was going to show up. So the studies have shown that potentially 30 to to even 70 or 80% of work that we do can actually be automated through RPA, right? And I think that creates, again, a lot of opportunity for us, especially in countries like Singapore, where we all want to look at how we could increase productivity rate, how we could drive, better, higher value for finance activities. And that's where RPA comes in and have a very good way of helping you remove some of these repetitive activities and bring finance to the next level of value add, right? Any questions of what RPA is while we wait for the slides? I know I'm not supposed to take questions now, but does it work? Okay, so this works. Let me come back to my slide. So this was the first slide that I have. So studies have shown by many organizations, right, not just from Deloitte, that RPA does impact a lot of what we do, right? And if you look at the statistics from the left all the way to the right, as much as 30 to 85% of activities or work that we do today in our organization can potentially be automated using robotic process automation, right? And I think this is something we all should consider again as we move forward in reshaping your finance organization, what you can do to really take away activities that are non-value add and then bring the higher value activities like what Wendy has mentioned in the earlier speech in shaping the way how finance works, so you can do more with less. So before I then go into the video of what RPA is, right, let me try and also share with you our view of what the entire the automation spectrum is, right? So RPA, if you look at this whole diagram, is really the activity on the far left, right? So if you look at the little diagram at the bottom, what RPA does, as I've explained earlier, it's really mimicking what we do as a human, right? So when we set up an RPA process, you typically define and tell the robot what exactly to do, right? So you need to state very clearly how you handle the processes, and where there are exceptions, you also need to tell the bot how to deal with exceptions, right? In some cases, a bot is not capable of assessing the error. You then have to abort the transaction and park that aside and allow the bot to only process those that are successful, and those that are not will then be left for us to go and deal with the exceptions, right? So defining all the rules from the start to the end needs to be done when we use RPA, right? So if you move gradually towards the right side of the spectrum, and that's where cognitive comes in, right? So cognitive is the concept where bots will then try to learn, right? And they will learn based on patterns and try to understand and be able to get some form of intelligence as they take on the activities. And if you move further right, then that's where you have artificial intelligence, right? I mean, you have probably heard of things like Watsons and all, where they can play chess and beat us in playing chess. So if you look at the entire spectrum, what happens today and what's very popular today is really RPA. But a lot of the organizations, as you can see, even banks like POSB or DBS today have launched a chatbot that allows you to go and talk to someone, using an application, and you think you are talking to a human being, but behind that is actually a chatbot that has some cognitive capabilities, right? So as we evolve, you will realize that the evolution of technology and automation will move very, very quickly, right? So one of the big changes, as I've spoken to a number of my colleagues across the world, is this concept of what we call natural language generation. A lot of us in finance spend substantial effort today writing commentaries on what we do, right? So natural language generation, or NLG, does the opposite. What it does is it takes structured data that you have, identify patterns, and then help you generate some commentary from data that you have, right? Again, you would realize that this falls more towards the right of the entire spectrum, and this is something that will probably come in play very aggressively in the next couple of years, right? So even within Deloitte itself, as you know, we have an audit practice, and a lot of this disruption are coming into play, and even the existence of auditors sitting there to do checking of data and writing exceptions or no exceptions could eventually be threatened as some of this technology comes into play. Okay, so that's really a view of how automation is. Then coming back to RPA, I think I've articulated some of this earlier in explaining what RPA does, right? So whenever we do an robotic process automation project, what we do is we look at the number of questions at the bottom we ask ourselves, right? Are there many different systems today? If you exist in an environment where you have one single ERP system that integrates your operations all the way to the end, to finance, to HR, and all your supporting functions, then RPA has no value in the organization because you already do have an integrated platform. But in reality, I think in many of your organizations, even after you have launched or implemented an SAP or an ERP or an Oracle platform, you would realize that IT will tell you, okay, you need to prioritize your requirements. We could only do a certain global core model. And eventually, you still end up with 20-30% of your teams working on very manual activities, right? This could be as simple as imputing data. It could be pulling reports. Every month end, you spend lots of time generating reports in the system. You still have someone using Excel, formatting the reports, sending the reports out to different departments. And again, if you think about all this, these are activities that using a robot, it could then help automate the entire process, right? Including pulling, formatting, and even distributing the process through emails to all your different stakeholders within the organization, right? So these are broadly the activities that what RPA can do, right? So everything from collating data, validating, recording, calculation, and even doing transporting or communication of information across the organization using emails and reporting as well. Okay, so that's really where RPA would have a use. So let me show you a video of what RPA can do, right? In this case, it's a scenario of where the robot receives an email with an attachment in PDF, and using that information, it tries to build and create the billing request into the accounting system. This video is available on YouTube, so if you want to bring it back to your organization and share with your colleagues, you could get the link from us. So in looking at the video, I think it's very apparent the benefits that RPA brings, right? So RPA would perform tasks a lot faster than what we do, and what it does is then increase the overall productivity of the finance organization. But what's more important is also really on the right-hand side, right? So you realize that, with RPA, as you can see in the video, a lot of the activities in transcribing data from that PDF into a system, if it's done by humans today, would typically incur some form of errors as we run through the transactions, right? Likewise, today when you do cut, paste transactions or activities within your organization, typically you would get issues around accuracy. And after that, you then get issues around staff satisfaction, right? As you hire people coming in today, they will get really tired if you get them to continuously do activities that are non-value added, right? So if you imagine the scenario of how RPA comes into play, right? A lot of all these activities can be done right at the start of the day, right? And the moment you get into the office at 8:30 or 9 o'clock, all this would already be done with the exceptions flagged out, so that then your team and your colleagues would then focus their day in resolving the exceptions, and that would substantially increase the amount of time they have for the rest of the day to do some of the other activities. Of course, the other key benefit RPA has is also the fact that it works 24 hours by 7, right? The activities can be scheduled to run at night. It can be, you can make the bot work 24 hours a day. A bot doesn't have to go for lunch. A bot doesn't needs to go for training. Doesn't go for leave, right? And if you think about it, that's something you can manage with less of an effort. And at the end of the day, the whole concept is to get all your processes hardened with robotics, so that then you spend a lot more time doing some of the other activities. And what this happens in terms of the implication to the operating model, right? I think most of us, if you're talking about shared services, you then look at why we are moving activities into a centralized function. And one of the key drivers is really to look at reducing costs and trying to drive standardization. And increasingly with RPA in play, I think many organizations have started to ask themselves, right, if they don't have a shared services today, what should they do? Should they be doing automation, or should they be still offshoring the work? Because the cost benefit has blurred now, right? Using RPA does help you drive efficiency and does help you reduce cost in the long run, right? So some of the organizations that I work with today come to us and say, look, we need to look at how we deploy RPA and a shared services program, right? Do we do it concurrently, and do we do one and not the other, right? So that's why I think one of the big impact that you have today is RPA will change the way you look at the finance operating model, right? If you work in a very small, lean finance organization, right, where say you only have 5-6 people per country, moving them into a shared services might not be as beneficial because the cost and effort to bring people together, and you don't have economies of scale, then RPA potentially can be one of the options to resolving some of this, right? For larger organizations, then it's going to be a combination of two, right? How do you then deploy robotics, but at the same time look at opportunities to centralize some of your operations to still bring standardization and scale, right? So that's one of the first implication when RPA comes in with respect to shared services. And you would also realize that in many BPO organizations today, this is probably one of the biggest projects they are taking, right, which is implementing RPA. For those of you who are using BPO, you would know that you spend every year trying to squeeze every dollar out of them to drive savings. And most of the time, what do? They just reduce their head counts in supporting you, and service standards deteriorate, right? So for them, now RPA is the best opportunity to shape the way they run activities so that they can continuously drive cost reduction, right? So in our practices in say India, for example, we have huge amount of traction and interest in RPA because India is a place where you still have BPO centers. There are thousands of people, right? So I think that's again an implication of where RPA comes in. Moving to our view on operational finance. So I think Wendy has covered the different dimensions of finance, right? So my focus today is really on operational finance. Operational finance is really where you do your AP, your AR, clearing of your AR, closing of your books. And operational finance, our view of operational finance is simply, putting together a fully automated an organized finance factory concept, right? And the reason why we call it a finance factory is we believe that there are a lot of opportunities and way to standardize the way we perform finance operations. And once you have that in place, again, if you remember the concept of RPA, if you have processes that are fairly standardized, the opportunity for you to then deploy RPA, not just across one of your business unit or one country, the opportunity to deploy RPA across your business units, across the regions, becomes more substantial, right? And the benefits that you get will again accrue and become a lot more substantial. The ability for you to manage your bots and react to changes in the business also becomes more agile because processes are a lot more standardized, right? And once you have the factory in place on the left-hand side, it then allows finance operations to look at a lot more value-added activities on the right. And that's where we look at putting in place things like continuous monitoring of controls, right? So, and you know, take a very simple example, say your expense claims process. In the past, I think when we all started our career, you probably still do 100% of checking of all expense claims. I think some of you still do that, right? But I think as time has gone by, you know, with continuous monitoring of controls and even of inputs submitted by users, say on expense claims, systems are able to help look at trends and help identify where there could be exceptions, right? So what this means is, in some organizations that I work with, checking expense claims can even be an afterthought event, right? After everything is submitted, you run some analytics and queries and you flag out exceptions and you focus only on that 10-20% to really randomly check, right? And again, that if you think about that, that's one way to substantially reduce our effort. Then process automation obviously drives productivity and quality, as I've mentioned earlier. And the other thing is really platforms, to enable integration of process, right? Most of you who have done work within your accounts payable function would realize that everything you do in AP is subjected to everything that's done upfront by procurement, right? And so if you think about the whole integration of tools and processes, it becomes increasingly important to look at how processes work end-to-end from procure all the way to pay, to then identify opportunities or how we can even streamline some of the operational finance process. And once you have all this in place, and we live in a world today where we have abundant data, right? So you have lots of financial data, and the question is, how do we then use this data and use technology to then bring greater value in terms of bringing insights into the business, right? So that's a perspective. That's our perspective of the future of operational finance. And when we talk about RPA, so in Deloitte, we do a global shared services survey every 2 years. So the latest 2017 survey was released, I think, somewhere in April or May this year. And in this survey this time around, we did ask the survey participants, what are some of the key enablers that you will put in place, and what is the interest level around RPA? And as you can see if you see the graph on the left-hand side, there's substantial interest in really using technology, including RPA, to drive how to improve and how to streamline operations within shared services organizations. But if you then look on the right-hand side, although a lot of organizations have indicated the desire to look at automation, the entire process has gone on fairly slowly, right? And this is really due to the fact that a lot of people are unfamiliar with what RPA is and are concerned with issues around what RPA does, right? I mean, I met a client last week and someone came to me and said, oh, this RPA looks cool, as you have seen on the video. It looks exactly like a Trojan horse. So it then generates fear because, it looks like someone remotely controlling your computer and running activities. And it does create concerns and fear, which then also brings the fact why in many organizations that I work with, finance tends to be the first to then work on RPA, simply because people trust the fact that you understand controls and risk, and if you deploy such a solution, it's because you're convinced that it works, right? So that's where, adoption has been slow, but I think increasingly as you start realizing and start looking at some of these tools, you will see that the benefits far outweigh some of the concerns that you have. And a lot of the concerns that people have around security are really not valid concerns, right? It's just really dealing with uncertainty in new technology. Okay, so that's where RPA will be deployed, at least in shared services and BPO. And all this comes back to what we look at in terms of the role of shared services, right? When we first started shared services, and the concept of shared services is so old, right? I mean, it's been there for decades. And when we all started shared services programs long time ago, the primary aim is usually around standardization, right? We exist in a region where you are rapidly growing in various markets. You then have, different finance functions sprouting out, and most of the time, as CFOs, your biggest worry is that how do I control what's happening in Vietnam? How do I know what's happening in Indonesia, for example? And that's where shared services has taken a lot of roots in at least within Asia Pacific, really to drive standardization, improving controls. But as we move down the maturity of shared services today, we are looking at optimization, right? Optimization means looking at how we can improve the existing processes running in the shared services, how we can do it better, how we can bring a bit more value or reporting into some of the stakeholders that we work with. And if you look forward, we now look into the world of automation, right? And the whole idea of automation, as I mentioned earlier, is really try to even get transactional activities, work in shared services reduced significantly, right? So people in shared services don't spend 80% of their time performing transactional services, but maybe 30%, and the rest of the time they can focus on doing more for the organizations, which then changes the value of shared services, right? Rather than just focusing on doing things better, I think it's all about now driving positive changes. This is a very busy slide. This is a heat map that we have on the opportunities for robotic process automation. You probably won't be able to see the little boxes at the bottom, but on the far left are the transactional activities, right? And you can see most of them are shaded blue or dark blue, which basically means they are good opportunities for automation. And as you know, most of these activities are activities that you would do or have your shared services perform today, right? So again, that's where shared services become a good starting platform for us to look at RPA, right? And within the spectrum of work that we do in finance, the other area where RPA has come in and helped is also around your very busy month-end or quarter-end closing process, right? In finance, you probably your calendars are so clear that the first week of every month you don't go out and do anything because you have to do closing. So RPA helps you, especially during month end, if you do a lot of reconciliation, reporting kind of work. A lot of this can be put in place into your processes so that at least you can then moderate the amount of additional effort you have to put in during month end, and hopefully from there you get better quality of life. Okay, let me just conclude with my last slide, right? So I will try and link up the challenges that we have in shared services today as a summary, and also talk about the implications after you have put in RPA within your organization. So this 5 points here basically talk about some of the challenges that you typically would have seen or have experienced within shared services today. The pressure is really around talent, right? If you have your shared services center in Malaysia, in Philippines, in India or China, I believe you face at least 20 to 30% of turnover every year, right? Bringing in people is not easy because shared services are increasingly still becoming very popular, and within Malaysia you can have your staff going to another organization, and with 10% of increment they would leave your organization. So managing the talent is important, and part of which it's really around the expectation of people that you hire, right? In most shared services organization, the average age of your employees there would be 30, right? And a lot of these people do have different aspirations in what they do, and if you get them to do very transactional work, that's not something that will help retain them, right? And that's where we have to look at how we can bring more variation and how we can meet the aspirations of the millennials, for example. So staff turnover, it's probably a common problem that you face. And for most of you who have shared services supporting you, you'll probably always come back with this feedback, oh, these guys are not doing anything extra, they're not adding any value, right? So these are, again, challenges that shared services face today in not just meeting your service level, but what they can do more to help you. And then there's increasing staff costs or increasing costs even in countries like Philippines, India, or in Malaysia, right? And the question is, how do you reduce costs as your staff costs continuously increase throughout the years. Then the service level challenges, right? How do you meet the service levels and not increase costs at the same time? Then we all say that robotics solve your problem, right? Then robotics come, but after that, robotics will come with a new set of challenges that you need to embrace and deal with. First one is really around your workforce capability, right? Processes will change such that from now, when you have RPA in place, your AP, your AR team will focus a lot on dealing with exceptions, right? They need to learn how to work with bots, right? And need to understand what are the different interaction points where the RPA would perform the activity and where the users will come in and resolve the issues, right? So this ability to interact and understand who is responsible for which activity becomes something that will change the organization. And the other thing is really around competency. In many cases, the reason why RPA has taken off very rapidly in this in this 1 year is simply because a lot of the RPA software in the market are fairly easy to use, right? And this grays the line between what IT does and what the business users does. Because most of the time, in many organizations that start implementing RPA, you would want some of your users to understand how to build, manage, and even modify some of the scripts or programs within the bots, because these are not very complex programming languages, right? So tomorrow, for example, if you change some structure, you add a different column to an activity that a bot needs to do, you no longer need to raise a ticket to IT and wait for 3 weeks for it to come back and fix that problem, right? With people in the organization and with competency to do RPA, you can fix it within an hour, test it, and have it deployed in the next 1 or 2 days. Then the concept of change management comes in, right? Most of the time, shared services don't go through the process of having staff worrying about losing their job. And this is probably something that will come in play when you implement bots, and most people will be concerned, in terms of the implication to their jobs, and that's something we need to deal with. Then it's also about managing a virtual workforce, right? So remember, RPA, if you want the robot to go into your SAP or Oracle to launch a transaction, for example, you actually need to give your bot a user ID and a password as well, right? So a bot is no different from a typical employee you to have, right? So managing virtual workforce is going to be important because you then have to look at some of the access controls in place, right? I think in one of the, especially in the financial services sector, we're doing a fairly large project with one of the banks here, and one of the big concerns HR come in is like, how do I onboard the bots? Because they need to have Windows ID, they need to have all this kind of ID. What do I do with them? Are they in the employee records or not? So dealing with the virtual workforce is something we need to change in terms of some of the policies that we have. And then the second last question is really, do we even need to have a shared services? I talked about that earlier on, right? And last but not least, with this in place, what can you then do better within the shared services such that, once you have released the capacity of your people, you can then really look at where you can, deploy more value-added services. And this slide, I won't run through the details of this slide, but one of the opportunities that then come through in looking at value-added services is, can the shared services also become, say, a center of excellence or shared services for robotics, right? Because as you start rolling out RPA within your shared services within finance, you would realize there will be substantial interest in many of the different departments in your organization in doing RPA, right? There are lots of opportunities in streamlining processes. For example, we are doing a project in Vietnam where we look at imputing sales order coming in from customers, right? This doesn't sit in finance, but the value of this process is not really about staff reduction because Vietnam's cost is obviously not high, but the value of automating this is every time a request from a customer comes in, the bot will pick it up, raise the sales order, and it directly gets transmitted to the factory, and processing of the work starts instantaneously. Right? At the end of the day, the entire turnaround time in fulfillment for the customer becomes faster as part of putting in a very simple process called RPA. Right? So look at, as you shape your shared services organization, what can you do more and build out, and the advice we have for clients that I work with is build up internal capabilities for RPA, because it does bring substantial benefit to the entire organization. Thank you very much.